Titan didn't whine. He didn't lower his ears in that textbook display of canine mourning you see plastered across the evening news. He planted his paws deep in the wet mud, bared his teeth, and snarled at the flag-draped mahogany. Something was inside the seal's casket. Dead wrong. Gavin hated funerals. He hated the forced solemnity, the suffocating smell of damp wool, and the way people whispered as if the dead were merely asleep in the next room, eavesdropping. Mostly, though, he hated standing in the freezing rain. Water seeped through the thin soles of his uniform shoes, chilling his toes to the bone. He shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt squeaking in protest. Beside him, Titan sat like a stone gargoyle. The German shepherd's dark coat was plastered to his ribs by the steady downpour. But the dog didn't shiver. Titan was a machine when he was on the clock. 80 pounds of muscle, teeth, and an olfactory system that Gavin trusted more than he trusted his own eyes. They were strictly there for crowd control. A perimeter detail. The cemetery was packed, a sea of black umbrellas and stiffly pressed military dress uniforms. It wasn't every day the city buried a Navy SEAL. It certainly wasn't every day they buried a female SEAL. Her name was Morgan Hayes. Gavin didn't know her. He'd read the same sanitized briefs as everyone else. A pioneer in naval special warfare, killed in action during a highly classified operation in a country the State Department wouldn't publicly name. The casket was closed. The brass had made that very clear. Closed casket, swift ceremony, full honors. Gavin chewed on the inside of his cheek, tasting stale morning coffee and copper. He scanned the crowd. The grief here didn't feel like the grief he was used to seeing at civilian burials. It felt rigid, rehearsed. The men and women in uniform stood with their jaws locked, staring straight ahead at the mahogany box resting on the lowering device over the open grave. A few rows back, a man who looked enough like the photos of Hayes to be her brother stood with his hands jammed into the pockets of a cheap trench coat. He wasn't looking at the casket. He was staring at the ground, his face pale and tight. A gust of wind swept through the headstones, carrying the sharp scent of ozone, crushed wet grass, and the cheap floral arrangements wilting under the rain. Titan broke his soot. Gavin glanced down, frowning. "Sit tight," he muttered, giving a barely perceptible tug on the leather lead. Titan didn't sit. The dog's ears swiveled forward, locking onto the center of the gravesite. His nose twitched, drawing in a long, rattling intake of air. Then another. The muscles in the dog's hindquarters coiled. Gavin's pulse ticked up a notch. He knew that body language. Titan was a dual-purpose K9. He was trained for apprehension, sure, but his primary utility, the reason they were standing in the cold rain instead of sitting in a warm cruiser, was detection, narcotics, and explosives. "Hey," Gavin hissed, snapping his fingers low by his hip. "Leave it." Titan ignored him. The dog took a half step forward, hitting the end of the short leash. The leather pulled taut against Gavin's gloved palm. Titan's tail went stiff, dropping down parallel to his hocks. A low, vibrating hum started in the back of the K9's throat. It wasn't a growl. Not yet. It was the sound Titan made when he caught a threshold scent. Gavin scanned the perimeter, his cynical brain instantly looking for the mundane explanation. Someone in the crowd smoking something they shouldn't? Unlikely, given the heavy military presence. A groundskeeper with fertilizer? Maybe. But Titan wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the maintenance sheds in the distance. The dog's amber eyes were burning a hole straight through the flag-draped casket. Gavin felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine, entirely at odds with the freezing temperature. No, he thought, absolutely not. This was a military funeral with admirals and brass from Washington standing 10 feet away. If Titan was picking up traces of unspent ordnance or gunpowder from the rifle squad standing by for the 21-gun salute, he needed to correct the dog now. "Titan, heel," Gavin commanded, putting real force into the leash. Titan's front paws scrambled in the mud, resisting the pull. The low hum in his throat morphed into a sharp staccato whine. He shoved his nose into the air, sweeping left, sweeping right, bracketing the invisible scent cone that was drifting off the raised platform. The wind shifted again, blowing directly from the grave toward them. Titan hit the end of the leash so hard he nearly pulled Gavin off his feet. A guttural bark ripped from the dog's chest. It was loud, deafeningly loud in the quiet reverence of the cemetery. Heads snapped toward them. A 3-star admiral blinked, breaking his stoic facade. Morgan Hayes's brother flinched. Gavin felt his face flush with immediate searing heat. "Quiet!" he barked at the dog, wrapping the leather lead twice around his hand to shorten it. He tried to drag Titan backward, away from the eye line of the mourners. But Titan dug his claws into the sod. He wasn't just alerting, he was frantic. He threw his weight forward, choking himself on his thick collar, coughing as the nylon restricted his windpipe, but refusing to break eye contact with the wooden box. He barked again, a rapid, frantic succession of sharp reports. Explosives. The thought hit Gavin like a physical blow. Titan's final alert for narcotics was an active scratch. His final alert for explosives was a passive sit. But when the concentration was overwhelming, or when the dog was confused by a mixture of scents, he broke protocol. Right now, Titan was losing his mind. Gavin looked at the mahogany box. The polished wood gleamed under the gray sky. Inside was the broken body of a national hero. But K-9s didn't care about medals. They didn't care about tridents or classified operations. They only cared about molecules. And something inside that casket was releasing molecules that told the dog a very dangerous truth. The silence following Titan's outburst was thick and suffocating, broken only by the steady drum of rain on umbrellas. Every eye in the front 3 rows was pinned on Gavin. He felt naked. He felt like a rent-a-cop who had just stumbled into a cathedral and kicked over the altar. "Officer," the voice cut through the damp air, sharp and unyielding. A man in a crisp navy dress uniform, a captain by the eagles on his collar, stepped out from under the canopy. His face was a mask of restrained fury. "Get that animal out of here. Immediately." Gavin's instinct screamed at him to comply. "Apologize. Drag the dog back to the cruiser. Write a report about an accidental misfire by a confused K-9 and spend the rest of the week hiding from his sergeant." He hauled back on the leash. "Titan, out. Move." Titan snapped his jaws, the sound a sharp clack of teeth. He threw his front weight into the air, twisting his body to evade Gavin's pull, and lunged toward the casket. The sheer force of it snapped Gavin's wet grip. The leash burned through his leather gloves, slipping a crucial few inches before Gavin clamped down with both hands, his boots sliding in the mud. "Titan!" Gavin yelled, the command cracking with panic. The dog didn't care. He was entirely consumed. He dragged Gavin 3 feet forward, closing the distance to the grave. They were now horribly, disrespectfully close to the lowering device. Titan dropped his nose to the edge of the artificial grass mat surrounding the pit, sniffing frantically, then reared up, planting his muddy front paws directly onto the side of the mahogany casket. Gas rippled through the civilian side of the crowd. A woman in a black veil covered her mouth. The captain surged forward, his hands balled into fists. "Are you out of your goddamn mind? Pull him off her." Gavin planted his feet, wrapping his arms around Titan's chest, trying to physically heave the 80-pound shepherd backward. But Titan was locked. The dog began to dig. His thick, blunt claws raked down the side of the lacquered wood with a sickening sh-sh-sh sound. He was trying to tear the box open. He's not sitting, Gavin realized, his breath coming in ragged gasps against the dog's wet fur. He's scratching. Active alert. Narcotics. Gavin froze. His hands loosened on Titan's harness. The dog continued to claw at the wood, whining a high, thin pitch of frustration. "Grab him!" the captain barked to two military police officers standing near the perimeter. They unclipped their sidearms and moved in, their faces grim. "Wait!" Gavin yelled, throwing one hand up to stop them. He was panting, rain dripping from his nose. He looked from the scratched mahogany to the captain's furious face. "Wait! Hold on. Officer, you are desecrating a military funeral," the captain said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "If you don't remove that dog in 3 seconds, my men will shoot it." Gavin looked down at Titan. The dog had stopped scratching and was now pressing his snout directly into the seam of the lid, drawing in massive amounts of air. Titan had been on the force for 5 years. He had found heroin hidden inside gas tanks, cocaine baked into drywall, and fentanyl compressed into children's toys. He had never, not once in his entire career, thrown a false positive with this level of intensity. Gavin was cynical. He knew the world was dirty. Cops were dirty, politicians were dirty, and the military was certainly not immune. But smuggling drugs inside a fallen seal's casket, the sheer audacity of it made Gavin's stomach churn. It was the perfect mule. A flag-draped casket arriving at Dover Air Force Base, treated with the utmost reverence, untouched by customs, unbothered by X-rays. Who would dare search the coffin of a hero killed in action? "He's alerting," Gavin said, his voice sounding entirely too small in the open air. "What?" the captain demanded. "My K9, Gavin said, louder this time, straightening up but keeping a firm grip on the leash. "He's an active narcotics detection dog he's indicating on the casket." The murmur from the crowd instantly escalated into a chaotic buzz. Morgan Hayes' brother stepped forward, stepping out from the cover of the umbrellas. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. "What did you just say?" The captain stepped between the brother and Gavin. "This is absurd. The animal is smelling the embalming fluids, or the wood finish. Officer, I will not ask you again." "He doesn't alert to formaldehyde," Gavin interrupted, the adrenaline finally burning away his embarrassment. He felt a cold, hard clarity settling into his chest. "He doesn't alert to wood polish. He alerts to methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. And he is hitting on this box hard enough to pull my arm out of its socket." "That is a fallen United States Navy SEAL," the captain roared, stepping so close Gavin could smell the spearmint gum on his breath. "You are out of your jurisdiction and out of your depth. MPs, secure the dog." The two military police officers reached for Titan's harness. Titan snapped his head around, bared his teeth, and let out a vicious rolling growl that stopped both men in their tracks. He wasn't biting, but he was guarding the source. "Back off," Gavin warned the MPS. He looked directly at the captain. The man's eyes were wide, the pupils blown tight. He was angry, yes. But looking closer, Gavin saw the tension in his jaw, the rigid posture. It wasn't just righteous indignation, it was panic. "Open it," Gavin said. The words hung in the rain, heavy and impossible. "Excuse me?" the captain whispered. "If there's nothing in there but a hero, then I'll turn in my badge. You can shoot my dog and I'll go to federal prison for desecration," Gavin said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But you and I both know this dog is right. Something is in there that shouldn't be." Morgan's brother pushed past the MPs. He looked at the casket, then at Gavin, then at the captain. "Open it," he said, his voice cracking. "Liam, stand down," the captain said smoothly, turning to the brother. "Your sister died for this country. We are not going to let a local cop with an untrained mutt humiliate her memory. She didn't want a closed casket," Liam said, his eyes welling up, the rain washing the tears down his face. "You told us her injuries were too severe. You told us we couldn't see her." He turned his gaze to the mahogany box. The deep scratches from Titan's claws marred the perfect finish. "Open the damn box." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The rain seemed to fall harder, beating a relentless tattoo against the taut nylon of the umbrellas. The crowd was paralyzed. The honor guard stood frozen, their rifles pointed uselessly at the sky. Gavin stood his ground. Titan leaned against his legs, still whining, his nose pointed relentlessly at the seam of the lid. "Captain," Gavin said, his tone shifting from defensive to authoritative. He was a cop on a scene now. "I have probable cause. Under state and federal law, a positive alert by a certified K-9 constitutes grounds for a search. This is military property on federal detail," the captain sneered, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "You have no jurisdiction here. Lower the casket." He barked at the civilian groundskeepers standing nervously by the winch. The groundskeepers didn't move. They looked at the cops, they looked at the Navy men, and wisely decided to become statues. "If you drop that box into the dirt, I will arrest you for tampering with evidence," Gavin lied. He didn't know if he could actually do that, but he said it with enough conviction that the captain hesitated. Liam Hayes walked over to the casket. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out and grabbed the brass handles securing the lid. "Get him away from there!" the captain yelled, lunging forward. Gavin unclipped his heavy Maglite flashlight from his belt, gripping it tightly. He stepped in front of the captain, putting himself between the Navy officer and the grieving brother. "Take one more step, and I'll drop you," Gavin said. It was a bluff, an incredibly stupid bluff that would likely end his career. But the pure, terrified energy radiating off the military brass convinced Gavin he was on the right side of the fight. Liam struggled with the latches. They were locked. "It's sealed," he gasped, pulling at the heavy wood. "Who has the key?" Nobody answered. The admirals in the front row were whispering furiously to their aides. The entire polished facade of the military funeral was crumbling into a wet, chaotic mess. Gavin looked at Titan. "Good boy," he whispered. He raised his Maglite, flipped it around so the heavy, jagged tail cap faced outward. He stepped past the captain, joined Liam at the side of the casket, and brought the heavy metal down on the brass locking mechanism. Clang! The sound echoed through the headstones. The captain screamed something, but Gavin ignored him. He brought the flashlight down again, putting his shoulder into it. Crack! The brass housing splintered. Gavin shifted to the other latch at the foot of the casket and smashed it twice. The metal gave way with a sickening crunch. Gavin holstered his light. He looked at Liam. The young man's face was a portrait of absolute terror. He wanted to know, but he was terrified of what he was about to see. A mangled sister? Empty space? "Together," Gavin said gently. They grabbed the heavy lip of the mahogany lid. The flag slipped, pooling into the wet mud. Gavin pulled. The lid was incredibly heavy, the hinges stiff. With a loud groan of protesting metal and wood, the casket swung open. Gavin braced himself for the smell of decay, or the heavy chemical odor of embalming fluid. Instead, the air was immediately filled with the harsh, acrid scent of acetone and vinegar. Titan went ballistic, barking furiously at the open box. Gavin stared. Liam staggered backward, his hands covering his mouth, a choked sob tearing from his throat. There was no body. There was no navy dress uniform, no folded hands, no medals pinned to a hero's chest. The interior of the casket was entirely hollowed out. The white satin lining had been ripped away. In its place were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of tightly wrapped rectangular bundles wrapped in thick industrial plastic. Vacuum-sealed bricks. They were stacked meticulously, filling the space where Morgan Hayes should have been resting. Gavin's mind raced. He had seen drug busts before. He had seen trunks full of cocaine. But this, the sheer volume of it, the weight, the logistics required to fly a military-grade coffin stuffed with tens of millions of dollars worth of pure narcotics into the country under the guise of a fallen soldier. It was brilliant. It was perfectly evil. "Where is she?" Liam screamed, turning on the captain. He grabbed the older man by the lapels of his soaked uniform. "Where the hell is my sister?" The captain didn't answer. He wasn't looking at Liam. He was staring at the bricks, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide and vacant. He slowly raised his hands in the air, taking a step backward. The military police officers, realizing exactly what they were standing over, drew their weapons, but not at Gavin. They leveled their sidearms at the captain and the two aides standing behind him. "Don't move, sir," one of the MPs said, his voice trembling. Gavin looked down into the box. He reached in, his leather glove brushing against the slick plastic of the nearest brick. It was heavy, dense. He pulled his flashlight back out and shone it down into the corners of the casket, looking for any sign, any clue. Beneath the bottom layer of the bricks pressed flat against the bare wood, Gavin saw something. It wasn't plastic. It was a small, olive-drab notebook, half crushed by the weight of the contraband. Gavin carefully wedged his fingers between the bricks and pulled the notebook free. The edges were singed, and the cover was stained with something dark and rust-colored. Blood. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with tight, hurried handwriting. He read the first line on the last entry. "If this reaches home, I am already dead. They know I found the supply line. Cole is compromised." Gavin snapped the book shut. Cole. He looked at the name tag on the captain's chest. Cole. Gavin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Morgan Hayes hadn't been killed in action by enemy fire. She had been murdered by her own command, stuffed into an unmarked grave halfway across the world, while her killers used her empty casket to import the very poison she had died trying to expose. Titan sat perfectly still beside the open casket, his nose twitching, waiting for his reward. The rain turned to sleet, tiny chips of ice biting into Gavin's exposed cheeks. The air around the open grave had fundamentally shifted. The solemn, manufactured grief of the military funeral evaporated, replaced by a volatile, crackling tension. The smell of acetone and vinegar from the vacuum-sealed bricks was overpowering. A harsh chemical burn in the back of Gavin's throat that completely masked the scent of wet earth. Captain Cole's hands were still raised, trembling slightly. The two young military police officers kept their sidearms leveled at his chest. Their faces were chalky, their eyes darting between their commanding officer and the hollowed-out casket filled with contraband. "Don't do anything stupid, sir," the taller MP said, his voice cracking on the last syllable. His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger guard. Cole didn't look at the MP. His eyes were locked on the olive-drab notebook clutched in Gavin's gloved hand. The captain's jaw muscles flexed, a rapid ticking motion under his skin. "You have no idea what you're holding, officer," Cole whispered. The words barely carried over the wind. "You think you're a hero? You're a dead man. Drop the book." Gavin tightened his grip. The notebook felt heavy, the pages swollen with dried blood and rainwater. He could feel the indentations of Morgan Hayes's hurried handwriting pressing through the cover. "I think," Gavin said, his voice remarkably flat despite the adrenaline hammering against his ribs, "you're in no position to issue commands, Captain." Liam Hayes was on his knees in the mud next to the casket. He reached out with a shaking, pale hand, his fingers brushing the thick industrial plastic of the nearest narcotic brick. He didn't seem to comprehend what it was. He was looking for his sister, searching the empty spaces between the drugs for some piece of her. A bone, a dog tag, anything. "Where is she?" Liam choked out, the sound tearing from his chest like ripped fabric. "What did you do to her?" Cole ignored the grieving brother entirely. He lunged. It wasn't a clumsy, desperate move. It was the explosive, calculated violence of a trained operator cornered in a bad spot. Cole didn't go for his own weapon. He went straight for Gavin, his hand hooked into a claw, aiming to rip the notebook away. Gavin had less than a second to react. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't reach for his baton. He simply opened his left hand and dropped the leather leash. "Get him." Titan didn't hesitate. The German Shepherd launched off his hind legs, 80 pounds of coiled muscle unspringing with devastating force. The dog didn't go for the arm. He went for center mass. Titan hit Cole square in the chest, the impact sounding like a baseball bat striking a heavy bag. Cole let out a sharp, breathless grunt as the dog's momentum carried them both backward into the slick, muddy grass. Titan's jaws clamped down heavily on the thick fabric of Cole's dress coat near the shoulder, his teeth tearing through the wool and biting into the Kevlar vest beneath. The dog didn't thrash. He pinned, using his sheer weight and a terrifying low growl to keep the officer pinned to the ground. "Call him off!" Cole screamed, thrashing his legs. He swung a desperate fist, connecting with Titan's ribs, but the dog didn't even flinch. Titan shifted his grip higher, closer to Cole's throat, his amber eyes locked onto the man's face. Gavin stepped forward slowly, his boots squelching in the mud. He stood over the thrashing captain, the sleet accumulating on his shoulders. He tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline at the base of his tongue. "Titan, hold," Gavin ordered softly. The dog froze, breathing heavily through his nose, hot air pluming in the freezing rain, but his teeth remained clamped tight. "Cuff him," Gavin said to the MPs. The two younger men scrambled forward, holstering their weapons and dragging Cole's arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs snapping shut was the loudest sound in the cemetery. Gavin crouched down, placing a hand on Titan's wet neck. "Ouse," he murmured. Titan immediately released his grip, backing away a single pace, licking his chops, his eyes never leaving the prisoner. Gavin pulled a small, brightly colored tug toy from his cargo pocket and tossed it to the dog. Titan caught it mid-air, his tail wagging furiously. He had done his job. To him, this wasn't a federal conspiracy. It was a game he had just won. The juxtaposition turned Gavin's stomach. He stood up and flipped open the notebook again. He needed to know before the alphabet agencies arrived and classified this entire mess into oblivion. He bypassed the blood-soaked edges, finding a page near the middle that remained relatively legible. The handwriting was jagged, sharp. They're using the repatriation flights. Dover's compromised. We bring home the fallen. They pack the caskets at the staging point in Ramstein. Cole is the logistics bottleneck. He signs the manifests. I found the ledger. Gavin turned the page. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. Cover blown. Ambush imminent. They can't let me board the flight home. If they kill me, they'll use my transport to move the next shipment. I dumped the hard drive and the ledger at the civilian transit hub. Storage Unit 412, West Side. Key is taped under the floorboard of my old Mustang. Gavin stopped reading. He looked at Liam, who was still weeping silently into his hands by the side of the desecrated coffin. "Liam," Gavin said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He stepped around the casket and knelt beside the young man. "Liam, look at me." Liam raised his head. His eyes were red, the rain washing away his tears as quickly as they fell. She knew," Gavin said, tapping the notebook. "Your sister knew exactly what they were doing. She caught them. She died trying to tear this whole thing down." "But where is she?" Liam whispered, his voice hoarse. "If she's not in there. Did they leave her over there? In the dirt?" Gavin looked at the open box. The cartels, the corrupt brass. They wouldn't leave a body to be found by local authorities overseas. A body with bullet holes that didn't match enemy fire. A body that would demand an autopsy. No, they would have to dispose of it somewhere completely untraceable. Or they would bring it back through unofficial channels to guarantee it disappeared forever. A cold, horrifying thought struck Gavin. The drugs were supposed to be picked up here. The casket was the mule. Once the funeral was over and the casket was buried, someone was going to come dig it up. They would empty the drugs. But a casket buried with full military honors couldn't stay empty. Eventually, ground settles. Sometimes graves are relocated. They needed weight in the box. Gavin turned sharply to Cole, who was being hauled to his feet by the MPs. The captain was bleeding from the shoulder where Titan had bitten through his coat. "You didn't leave her behind, did you?" Gavin asked, his voice dead and hollow. "You couldn't. You brought her back on a different flight, a civilian flight. You needed to put her body in this box tonight, after you took the drugs out." Cole smirked, a cruel, bloody stretching of his lips. "You're a smart cop. Too bad you're not smart enough to walk away." Gavin felt a surge of pure, unfiltered rage. He wanted to unclip Titan again. He wanted to let the dog finish the job. Instead, he pulled his radio microphone from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need the FBI Field Office Supervisor on the line. Now. And send an evidence transport team to the West Side Storage Facility. We're going hunting." The West Side Storage Facility smelled like oxidized copper, decaying leaves, and the stagnant, oily puddle water that collected in the cracked asphalt of the industrial district. The rain had finally stopped, but it left behind a biting, damp cold that seemed to bypass Gavin's jacket entirely, settling deep into his joints. He hated this part of town. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. Endless rows of corrugated aluminum doors rusting under flickering sodium streetlights that buzzed with a dying, erratic frequency. They walked in absolute silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, abrasive clicking of Titan's claws on the uneven pavement and the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the two federal agents flanking them. Liam Hayes walked 2 paces behind Gavin. The young man had completely refused the paramedics' offers of a shock blanket and a warm ambulance. He walked like a ghost, haunting the perimeter of his own life, his trench coat wrapped tightly around a thin, shivering frame. His eyes were wide, fixed on the painted numbers on the doors, dreading the moment they would stop. "Unit 412, the lead agent murmured, his breath pluming in the frigid night air. He clicked on a massive, heavy-duty flashlight, the harsh white beam cutting through the fog and illuminating the peeling red paint of the roll-up door. A thick, industrial-grade steel padlock secured the latch. It looked impossibly sturdy, a final barrier between the lie of the cemetery and the ugly, unvarnished truth. Gavin did not wait for the tactical team to bring up the heavy bolt cutters. His hands were numb, his leather gloves soaked through with freezing mud. He dug into his cargo pocket and pulled out the small, jagged brass key they had recovered from the taped underside of Morgan's rusted Mustang floorboards. The metal felt like a shard of ice against his palm. He slid it into the lock. It stuck for a fraction of a second, catching on internal rust, before turning with a heavy, satisfying metallic chunk. He pulled the padlock free, its weight significant in his hand, and tossed it onto the wet asphalt. It hit a puddle with a dull splash. Gavin grabbed the cold, damp handle of the door. With a sharp grunt of effort, he heaved it upward. The corrugated metal screamed as it rolled upward on unlubricated, rusted tracks. The noise was violent, a shrieking echo that bounced off the surrounding cinder-block walls and faded into the dark. The air inside the unit instantly spilled out, hitting Gavin in the face. It was completely stagnant, carrying a sharp, metallic odor that Gavin recognized with a sickening jolt of his pulse. It was not the chemical acetone burn of narcotics. It was the heavy, iron-rich scent of dried blood mixed with the distinct artificial chill of refrigeration. He stepped over the concrete threshold, clicking on his own flashlight. The beam swept the darkness, throwing long, distorted shadows against the bare walls. The unit was remarkably bare. In the far corner sat a rusted metal folding table. On top of it rested a thick black pelican case, sealed tight. The ledger, the hard drive, the undeniable proof that would systematically dismantle Captain Cole's entire logistical empire and send him, along with half a dozen other compromised brass, to a federal supermax for the rest of their natural lives. "Secure the drives," the federal agent commanded softly, gesturing to his partner, who immediately stepped forward to bag the case. But Gavin was not looking at the table. His flashlight beam remained fixed on the center of the cracked concrete floor, where a massive white industrial chest freezer sat humming. A thick black power cord snaked from the lower vent into a nearby wall outlet. Gavin unclipped the brass snap of Titan's leather leash. "Search!" he whispered, his voice cracking. Titan did not surge forward with the frantic, manic energy of a narcotics hunt. His entire posture fundamentally shifted. The dog lowered his head, his ears pinning back slightly against his skull. He walked slowly, deliberately, his nose skimming just an inch above the freezing concrete floor. He approached the humming white chest. He did not bark. He did not aggressively scratch at the enamel. He simply walked to the left corner, pressed his wet snout directly against the rubber seal of the lid, inhaled deeply, and sat perfectly still in the dust. He let out a single, low, terribly mournful whine. It was his human remains alert. Liam released a sound that Gavin knew would echo in his nightmares for years. It was not a cry. It was a hollow, animalistic keen, the sound of absolute structural collapse. Liam's knees simply gave out. He dropped onto the filthy concrete, wrapping his arms fiercely around his own stomach as if trying to physically hold his internal organs inside his body. He rocked back and forth, weeping without drawing breath. Gavin stepped forward. He placed his ungloved hand on the cold enamel lid. Taking a jagged breath, tasting the stale air, he lifted it. The frost hit his face instantly. Inside, wrapped in simple, unceremonious clear plastic sheeting, lay Morgan Hayes. She still wore the tactical uniform she had died in. There was no flag. There was no polished mahogany. The cartel had treated her like absolute garbage, preserving her just long enough to use her body as a gruesome replacement weight in a desecrated grave. Gavin stared at her frozen face. She looked fiercely exhausted, her jaw set stubbornly, even in death. She had died a warrior. He gently touched the frozen plastic wrapping. "We got them," he whispered. He slowly reached under his jacket and unpinned his silver police badge. It was not a prestigious military medal, but it was everything he had. He laid the cold medal upon her chest. Titan stepped up beside him, gently nudging Gavin's trembling hand with a wet nose. They turned and walked out into the dark, silent night, leaving the dead to finally rest peacefully. What did Gavin just uncover, and where is the real Morgan Hayes? The truth goes deeper and darker than anyone standing in that graveyard could have ever anticipated. If you want to find out what happened to the missing seal and the conspiracy Titan sniffed out, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Drop a comment below with your theories. Was it an inside job or something much worse? See you in the next part.